Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody is doing well, and welcome to our webcast. I'm Brett Perlman. I'm the CEO of the Center for Houston's Future, and I'm actually pleased to be hosting this webcast today on Houston as a hydrogen hub. We weren't sure if we were going to make it or not, but I see we have over 100 attendees and probably more joining as we move forward. So hope everybody is doing well. And has power and hopefully water back and has made it through this week. It's been a very trying week for all of us. For those of you who don't know us at the center, we are a nonprofit organization that brings together business, government, and community stakeholders to work on the most important issues in the Houston region. Today's webcast focuses as part of our energy and climate change series, and really will highlight some of the center's work on the low carbon energy initiative. We have worked extensively in developing a vision for Houston as a low carbon energy capital. And let me just having a little trouble with the slides. So let me just see if I can get the slides to work here. Try that one more time. Well,
that's working now, Brett.
Huh?
That's where we can see a slide now.
Okay, there it goes. Okay. So this is a little bit about the center. As I mentioned, this is one of our strategic initiatives. And we have worked extensively over the last year on developing a vision for Houston as a low carbon energy capital. Last year, we published an extensive report along with our partners from the University of Houston and the consulting firm KPMG called Houston, the Low Carbon Energy Capital, 4 Ways Forward. And this is available on our website. And we held a major conference called the Houston Low Carbon Energy Innovation Summit. And during that conference, we highlighted the 4 areas that I mentioned, 2 of which we'll be discussing today, hydrogen and carbon capture. And as we get into this discussion, you'll perhaps see why we're so excited about the combination of creating a hydrogen hub in Houston and then combining that with our deep expertise and a number of the opportunities that we see to capture CO2. So we'll explain that as we go on. We also looked at 2 other areas, low carbon grid. And as we know, Texas is the #1 wind producing state and also a leader in solar. And as we've seen, we have reliability challenges, as we've seen this week. But we actually believe that there may be opportunities to solve some of those reliability challenges with hydrogen. Perhaps we'll have a chance to discuss that a little bit more. And then finally, we did some work on circular economy and plastics recycling. And so throughout the year, we'll be highlighting these 4 areas. For those of you who didn't see the paper on Monday, some of our work was highlighted in this Houston, Texas Inc. section, which really told the story of how Houston is positioned to become a leader in hydrogen energy. And as I mentioned in the article, and this was quoted in the story, we don't think of hydrogen today as an industry, as a separate industry, but if we start to think about it, Houston can be a very important and large player, not only in the US, but globally. So that's kind of what we'll be discussing today. And going forward, given we will soon release 2 white papers on carbon capture and hydrogen, which will show how Houston can create a low carbon on this work, as well as some of our work around world energy prices and their impact on the Texas economy. So I'm pleased to welcome today Daryl Wilson, who's the Executive Director of the Hydrogen Council, to discuss a vision of the role that hydrogen can play in decarbonizing energy sector. And Daryl, you can go ahead and turn your video on there. Daryl recently, hi Daryl, Recently joined the council after a very successful career building organizations and intersecting at the intersection of environmental and sustainability issues. He was most recently the global CEO for Hydrogenics, a fuel cell and electrolysis technologies company that was successfully sold to Cummins. Prior to Hydrogenics, he had a variety of roles in environmental technology, operations, manufacturing, human resources at companies such as Toyota and Dofasco. He's now leading the Hydrogen Council, which is a global CEO-led initiative of leading companies with united vision and long-term ambition to make hydrogen clean energy, to help hydrogen become the clean energy source for a more resilient future. And he's going to lead this next stage of this work. He recently joined the Hydrogen Council to lead it into its next stage of growth. What we're going to do today is I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview for those who aren't familiar with hydrogen, and then we'll turn it over to Daryl for his comments, perhaps for about 20 minutes of comments, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. If you'd like to submit questions in the chat feature, we'll have about 15 minutes of questions, and we'll probably end just a little bit before the hour. So just to start off, I wanted to highlight a few things from our work on hydrogen. And for those who aren't familiar and haven't been following this industry, it's really been quite remarkable in the last, I think, 6 months to a year, how this has taken off. And some of the companies that you see, Shell, BP, the Port of LA, the Europeans have all announced major initiatives around hydrogen. Now, you may ask, why hydrogen? And what is hydrogen? Well, as we know, hydrogen is a abundant element, and it has some unique characteristics that make it particularly suitable for uses in decarbonization. It can be used as a carrier of energy. It can be used in power applications. It can be used in process heat applications. And it's also very clean. It can be burned as a very clean fuel. It can be operated with a fuel cell. And so really, it provides lots of opportunities. In fact, I think I called it the Swiss Army knife of fuels. And it's very plentiful as well, but it requires a manufacturing process to create. It doesn't exist on its own in nature. And so how we create hydrogen, which we'll talk about in a second, is going to be part of the story. It also has lots of applications in transport and power storage, and in fuels. So in terms of hydrogen, how we get hydrogen, there's two basic ways today. One is through a process called steam methane reforming, which takes natural gas, takes it through a production plant, and then today that creates hydrogen and CO2. And then going forward, that CO2 can be captured and stored, and then can be used in these different applications. Tomorrow, in the future, we may have another option for hydrogen, and that's through creating it through renewable energy, which is very abundant in Texas, through a process of electrolysis that basically creates hydrogen and oxygen. And so both of these ways of creating hydrogen, I think, are ways that we will have in Texas going forward. Today, we primarily have that first way that I talked about, which is through the process of steam methane reforming. And this is, a picture of the assets that we have in Texas. It's quite a, an interesting story because as I mentioned, we are one of the world's largest producers of hydrogen with the system that we have in the Gulf Coast. We have over 900 miles of hydrogen pipelines, over 50% of the US capacity and 32% of the global pipelines. We produce 3.4 million metric tons of hydrogen annually through the steam methane reforming process. And that's about 34%. So the US produces about 11 million metric tons of hydrogen. And one of the places that has been, lauded for its hydrogen production or its vision for hydrogen is Rotterdam, and they've done an amazing job. But this system is 8.5 times the size of the Rotterdam system. So the opportunity, if we can create a vision for hydrogen in Texas, is absolutely immense. We have 48 plants producing hydrogen, some of those dedicated, some of those producing what's called byproduct hydrogen. And we also have something that's unique in the sense of we have a very large network of storage. And so the combination of hydrogen and perhaps storage may be something we talk about and may provide some of those reliability benefits I mentioned a few minutes ago. So how can hydrogen be used? As I mentioned before, it can be used in trucking and transportation, primarily in trucking. And we'll talk perhaps a little bit about why that might be. It might be injected into gas networks and used as a way to decarbonize our gas system. It might be used in industrial heat processes as well. So these are just a couple of the ways in which hydrogen can be used. And we at the center have done extensive work in looking at these applications and are starting with some pilots to catalyze some of the early work that we think can be done to start to build this ecosystem of hydrogen in the Gulf Coast region. Perhaps more on that as we move through the year and talk a little bit more about our work. And then finally, this is kind of a vision for where we think hydrogen might go. As I mentioned, the two predominant forms of the way hydrogen can be produced are through steam methane reforming. And when combined with CCUS, we call that blue hydrogen. And electrolysis, as I mentioned, that technology is just coming online. And so what we see is a picture of where hydrogen might go over time is that this could be a huge growth market. In fact, some analysts have predicted that this market could be 10 times the size of the market today. And we see this evolution occurring first from gray to blue, leveraging, at least on the Gulf Coast, our steam methane reforming infrastructure, which I just showed you, and combining it with CCUS. And then over time, growing a green path as well through electrolysis and through the extensive amount of both solar and wind that we have in Texas. And so really, this is I think, a bright future for what hydrogen might become. And so I'll just conclude with this picture of what our vision might be for a Houston hydrogen hub that would basically integrate the infrastructure we have with these new applications, and then could produce hydrogen that we could really use not only to decarbonize our own energy system, but could really ship across the globe. And so this is our vision in Houston of how do we take the system we have now, which is basically used primarily for refining oil, to create this Houston hydrogen hub, which would be, we believe, one of the leading global hubs for hydrogen going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daryl and let him make a few comments. I think he may have a slide or two to share as well. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn the screen over to him. Welcome, Daryl. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. You can hear me okay?
I can hear you.
That's good. Well, good day, everyone. Nice to be with you. I'm speaking to you from Canada, where we had 14 inches of snow on Saturday morning and another foot of snow on Monday morning. And the lights are on, the cars are on the roads, people are going to work, everything's normal. So sorry for your trouble. It's all about what gets thrown at you and your ability to manage it. And these days we have a lot of change happening in the climate and in many other things. And so responding to change adaptively and creatively is, of course, a critical issue in the world of energy as well. I'm going to make a few remarks and then throw it open for questions. I'm speaking to you on behalf of the Hydrogen Council, which is an international coalition of CEOs that was formed in 2017. And I'm going to draw my conclusions more from a global perspective. It's not my role to speak into your country or your local state situation, but happy to be a resource today and answer your questions about hydrogen. I'm going to try and share the presentation now. Brett, just let me know if that comes on the screen successfully.
I believe I can see it.
Okay.
Yep, there you go.
And is the slide changing okay?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, good. So as I mentioned, the Hydrogen Council was formed back in 2017 in Davos. And today, the original 13 member companies has grown to 109 companies. I will be sharing these slides with you afterwards, so do feel free to know that that's coming as a reference for you if that's helpful. You can see on the council we have a wide diversity of members across many different industry sectors in energy and oil and gas, in transport. In the upper portion, the steering members of the council, many large, well-known international companies, and in the lower portion, many of the leading technology companies in the world when it comes to hydrogen technology experience. You may or may not be aware that this is an area that's getting a lot of focus around the world, and many countries have set up very detailed strategies and put substantial funding to the deployment of hydrogen technology. The leaders today are in Korea, Japan, and China, as well as the European Union, Germany, and France. And you can see, in fact, the current situation in the US is quite far behind many other countries where there is a national roadmap, and in some states there are industry roadmaps, but those have not been fully adopted on a national basis by both government and industry, and there have not been targets and funding associated with those roadmaps to date. Brett, the slides are still showing okay, are they?
Yeah, I can see them.
Okay, good. A very large amount of money has started to flow into the sector. So you can see across here announcements of funding in the order of 11 billion in Germany, almost 11 billion in Spain, and 9 billion in France. A very large number still under development in the European Union. And again, when it comes to the North American side of things, the US, Canada, much smaller by comparison to what's going on in Europe. An important thing that's brought out in this slide is as these policies are set around the world in various countries, we pay attention to whether it's focused on the upstream or the downstream, the generation and supply of hydrogen, or the offtake and use of hydrogen. And the most mature policies are actually focused on both the upstream and the downstream. So there's a lot of good thinking around the offtake demand for hydrogen as well as the supply of hydrogen. Just this week, the Hydrogen Council produced its latest report publicly. This is available on the Hydrogen Council website. Here we're tracking investment in the sector and profiled 228 recently announced projects. 90 of these having to do with large-scale industrial usage of hydrogen, 50 in transport, and then the balance in various other applications. And you can see out of 128, 126 of these, 228, 126 are based in Europe. So lots of activity in Europe, Asia, and Australia. The total expenditure that's forecast on this portfolio of projects is more than 350 billion US dollars. That's 350 billion US dollars. And the portion that's beyond the initial investment decision and into engineering planning totals 80 billion. So there's a lot more going on in hydrogen than perhaps you realized, and a lot more money starting to move into the sector. So let's talk a little bit more about why this is happening and where it's happening. Here I'm going to skip this quickly. It's a reference to kind of the current deployment around the world of hydrogen fueling stations, fuel cell vehicles, and electrolysis capacity. Back on the council just briefly, One of the key things that we do is aggregate data from industry. So from our more than 100 members now, we collect their projections on cost and forecast on hydrogen demand and application maturity. And then we produce reports based on the aggregated data that's been processed through a clean room so that the confidentiality of the data is maintained. But it's a very, very strong fact base in order for us to speak about the progress of the sector. The sector is multi-dimensional, and this is a depiction of all of the different ways that hydrogen can interact in the energy economy. You probably are aware that while hydrogen is naturally very prevalent, in fact, the most prevalent element in the universe, you can't dig it up out of the ground in an easy manner. And so it functions as an energy carrier, not as an energy source. And as Brett was saying earlier, there are two methodologies to produce hydrogen, one through electrolysis, the splitting of water, and the other to strip hydrogen from natural gas. And more than 95% of the hydrogen produced in the world is actually through the natural gas pathway today. But once we have the hydrogen, it can function in moving energy around in our economy in many, many different ways. And so to help us understand the current maturity and competitiveness of these different applications in hydrogen, we use a chart with this profile. So moving from the bottom to the top, these are the solutions that are the most competitive low carbon solution. And then moving left to right, as you move more to the right, hydrogen is more competitive relative to conventional options for whatever that application might be. So the sweet spot in this chart is the upper right-hand quadrant. And now you start to see the applications allocated across that matrix. And so on the top right-hand side, you see fertilizer production using ammonia, refining operations in steel, as well as many heavy transport applications are the most competitive from the standpoint of conventional solutions for transport and processing needs, and also the most competitive against green alternatives. So this is indeed from a global point of view where we see the first merit order of hydrogen applications being deployed around the world. The other applications on here we do expect to follow, and they will continue to grow up and mature in their cost profile. But the most competitive and most attractive applications are on the right-hand side of the slide. In January, we produced another report showing the different decarbonization pathways using hydrogen and the extent of CO2 and greenhouse gas emission reductions. And here you can see across the slide on many, many different applications, hydrogen can deliver between 80 and 95% decarbonization. And this is in fact the main policy vector that's causing a lot of attention to turn to hydrogen now. In fact, those who are pursuing the goals around climate change mitigation under the Paris Accord need to realize that really those goals cannot be achieved without bringing a very strong contribution from hydrogen. So approximately 20% of the world energy use forecasted by 2050, if we're using the climate change goals under the Paris Accord as a reference point, 20% of the energy used at the point of 2050 would actually be in the form of hydrogen. So that's kind of where the sector impact and full maturity shows up. To get to that point in 2050 would be a $2.5 trillion investment. So there's lots of investment flow and employment and economic impacts in adopting hydrogen at scale with the vision through to 2050 from the decarbonization point of view. You may be familiar with the blue and green and other colors debate in hydrogen. This issue is addressed in our January report as well on decarbonization pathways. Essentially, our view is that if we want to meet our decarbonization objectives through to 2050, we must be using a combination of blue and green hydrogen. The merit advantage of blue hydrogen is those projects will typically be at larger scale, faster, and at a lower cost than the green hydrogen projects. Over time, we expect green hydrogen to become more cost competitive, and actually take a strong place in the long-term picture, but blue hydrogen absolutely has an important contribution. Brett was mentioning earlier that Texas is one of the major centers in the world for the production of hydrogen, mostly in the support of the refining industry. And so you have a lot of practice around producing hydrogen in the gray approach, the steam methane reforming approach. This is where hydrogen is produced and no CO2 is captured. With blue hydrogen, we're producing the hydrogen from steam methane reforming or autothermal reforming, and then capturing and sequestering the carbon. And in fact, the state of Texas is the home to the largest capacity in the world of carbon capture and storage technology. So this brings in another dimension of your local natural skills endowment and resources and know-how. You're already deeply involved in Texas with the production of blue hydrogen. And then on the green side, there's also a Texas story, because I'm well aware of all the wind power and solar power that's being developed over a long number of years. And so you have the input energy for the production of green hydrogen with electrolysis. When I mention renewable energy, it's important to have a vision how that the ongoing deployment of renewable energy is an integral part of the growth in the hydrogen story. On a global basis, we see, to fulfill that vision I was showing on the previous slide, that there would be a requirement for more than 27,000 gigawatts of capacity in renewable energy production. That's enough wind to completely surround the British Isles, or enough solar to fill up the whole of the country of Spain. Now that's the renewable energy required on a global basis to fulfill the vision of hydrogen that I was sharing from the earlier slide. But it just gives you a very graphic illustration of how these two things go hand in hand. And in fact, hydrogen technology is a wonderful storage container for renewable energy. We're well familiar, of course, with storing energy in batteries. But battery technology, from a storage capacity point of view, as far as kilowatt hours or gigawatt hours are concerned, batteries are pretty small containers. By contrast, the amount of energy that can be stored in hydrogen is dramatically higher. And that's why hydrogen technology is being seen as a very strong complement to the ongoing deployment of renewable power generation. If we put all of these points together, you can see in the center of the slide, if we have a scenario where we're just talking about green hydrogen, the cost of developing that scenario through to 2050 that I was showing would be $3 trillion. If we did it all in blue hydrogen, it would be $1 trillion. So there's where you see the difference in the CapEx involved in blue versus green hydrogen. The combined scenario that we depicted as an example would be $2 trillion. And then on the left-hand side, you can see the amount of emissions that would be generated from the all green story versus the all blue story versus the combined story. So naturally, if we did an all green scenario, that would result in the lowest amount of emissions being generated between now and 2050, whereas the combined story at 16 gigatons would be somewhere between the all blue and the all green story. Part of our work on the council is to forecast the economics and cost profile of the technology as it continues to mature. And so we produce charts like this, which shows the cost of green hydrogen coming down over time, the cost of blue hydrogen already substantially lower than green hydrogen. This is the point that I was making earlier. More can be done more quickly and at lower cost with blue hydrogen. And this is where a lot of the capability of Texas exists. And so on an economic basis, you have a head start. However, the profile of green hydrogen, of course, will be of strong interest to those who have substantial renewable energy capability. Now, these reductions in cost are not going to happen all by themselves with the passage of time. It requires the deployment of 65 gigawatts of electrolysis capacity to cause the electrolysis industry to grow up and mature. And that would cost roughly $50 billion to bridge the gap between the cost of blue hydrogen and the cost of green hydrogen. So what we expect to have happen is, depending on the region or the area, there will be a bias toward the green story or the blue story. Or in special cases like Texas, you'll actually have both the blue and green story unfolding likely together. The policy impact of carbon taxes is reflected on this slide. So you can see the gray hydrogen story, which is the typical way of producing hydrogen today for industry. And that's the steam methane reforming plants that you have in Texas, more than 40 of them. We expect the cost of operating those plants under a carbon tax scenario will rise around the world. And so in 2030, an important crossover point happens where the cost of blue, green, and gray hydrogen intersects. Now, that is strongly impacted by the cost of renewable energy generation. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see that areas, countries like Chile that have very, very strong renewable energy production capability, a lot of sunshine and very low cost, will be able to produce green hydrogen at a very low cost. So I'm going to sum up so that we have lots of time for questions and just make these 4 final points. As an energy carrier, hydrogen represents the most versatile carbon-free path, which can be adopted from the local resource endowment of natural gas and underground reservoir resources, or also from green resources. So with that versatility of the blue story and the green story, hydrogen has the ability to deliver across all geographies as a complement to renewable power generation or as a complement to experience in the oil and gas sector. I mentioned earlier that the longer term aspiration as set out by the International Energy Agency, hydrogen would reach 17%, others have said 18 or 20%, but it will represent eventually a very substantial part of our energy economy because of the decarbonization contribution of using energy with no carbon whatsoever. This next point is very important, and in my business experience of 15 years in hydrogen, it is a very interesting point of getting the discussion going in a particular region. The storage and stabilization functions of hydrogen are a critical aspect of integrating more renewable energy into our economy. And what we've seen happen in Germany and other places that have had a rising share of renewable power generation in their jurisdiction is as the portion of renewable energy rises, the need for storage becomes more clear. And then the amount of storage required dawns on the policymakers who made the big plan on renewables. And it turns out that hydrogen is a very, very important answer to the storage and stabilization needs on the grid. And what I have found several times over is an integrated view of energy in a local area where the gas grid people and the electrical grid people are talking to each other is a very critical part of extending the discussion in a holistic and thoughtful and systemic way in order to realize the benefit of hydrogen. Unfortunately, many of our energy utilities have had divorces over the years, and now there's the two solitudes of the electrical system and the gas system. And one of the things that hydrogen could do is bring those parties back together and start looking at the energy system on an integrated, holistic way. And that's one of the conversations that I would strongly encourage in the state of Texas because of your natural gas operations and hydrogen operation capability, as well as your renewable power capability. When those parties all come together and start thinking about energy holistically, some very good outcomes start to arise. And finally, historically, cost has been the major impediment for hydrogen technology to progress. But now I think things are changing. From the Hydrogen Council side of things, we've shown the downward trajectory. So that virtuous cycle that we've seen happen with wind and solar technology, that will happen as well with hydrogen. And on that account, it's possible to start planning now on our climate change and decarbonization journey, how hydrogen can be a tool for us to realize some of our objectives. So with that, I'm going to stop. Brett, I know I throw in a lot of information out there, but hopefully it's a fertile ground for lots of questions, and I'll turn it back over to you now.
Yes, and we do have a lot of questions, and we have about 15 minutes. So why don't we just kind of delve into here? And why don't we start with the last point you made? Obviously, this week, people's thoughts are really, on energy and electricity in particular. And one of the things I think we're learning is that, we don't know what had caused the blackout, but one of the hypotheses is this the lack of integration perhaps between the gas system and the electric system. So could you just, and I know you're not an expert in Texas, but can you opine about the role that hydrogen might play? I think the point you made just a second ago about sort of bringing these two different worlds together. How might that play out, and how could that play out in a place like Texas, do you think?
For sure. So this is the point about resilience, and you're living that this week. It's a very difficult situation, I'm sure, for many of you. Typically, diesel generation has been the emergency energy backup means, and I'm sure there's lots of diesel generators running in the state today. Hydrogen has the full capability to displace diesel. And I've lived this in my own history. Our hydrogen technology company from Canada was bought by one of the largest diesel engine manufacturers in the world, Cummins. And there's good reason for that. If you're going to decarbonize the functions that diesel generates today, you can't do it with batteries. There's simply not enough energy available in a battery set to deliver the kind of energy that you can get from diesel. Hydrogen has a very important role to play in emergency backup power. In fact, some of the large data center providers around the world, including Microsoft, who's a member of the council, are now looking to fuel cell and hydrogen technology to deliver the mission that's currently covered by diesel. And these are not small data centers. Perhaps you're well aware that there's many, many megawatts of power that are involved in these data centers. And Microsoft is seeing the opportunity to couple renewable power generation on hydrogen and then fully displace diesel as part of the energy equation. So you can see that the technology has the ability to scale to provide substantial energy capability.
Okay, that's interesting. Another question I just want to have you address this and maybe take it off the table is the issue around safety. So can you talk a little bit about hydrogen and safety issues?
It's likely that there's many people in this meeting who could speak to this better than I can locally, because hydrogen has been used in very, very large quantities for a long time in Texas. And I doubt you've heard about many incidents or accidents at all. So the largest consumption of hydrogen in the world today is to make ammonia fertilizer and also to be part of the processing inside refinery complexes. So there's lots of industrial history. There are many international standards, but safety is, of course, a priority for the industry and one of the priorities of the council. Our focus is on the application of hydrogen in new sectors where it has not been before. So inside a refinery fence, lots of experience and capability, but when we start to deploy hydrogen for buses, trucks, and trains, we need to make sure that the rubric of standards and practices around the use of hydrogen in new ways is fully in track with the growth of the sector. Some of you might remember when we just started to use natural gas. You have to be a little bit older for that, but natural gas wasn't always used in homes for heating or in general applications. And we went through a process where you had to learn how to do that safely and properly. And the same evolution needs to happen with hydrogen, but the codes and standards are there for industrial practices. And as we migrate to broader practice in the world, we need to make sure that we stay ahead of the safety protocols. Anytime we concentrate energy, whether it's electricity or natural gas, there's a hazard, and that hazard has to be managed, and hydrogen is no different.
Good. Well, thanks for that. Oh, I want to go to a question from Charles Saunders because I love this question. It's taking me to task a little bit, talking about electrolysis and that being industrial scale tomorrow. And he says the Air Liquide has just started its largest PEM electrolyzer, I guess, up in Quebec. So he is saying that it's actually yesterday for North America that we are already behind. I wonder if you could comment on how that part of the industry is starting to develop.
Well, I actually sold that project to Air Liquide, and it was my team that delivered that project. And I'm very proud of the fact that they did that without me after I left Hydrogenics and Cummins took over. That project was started up in October here in Canada of last year. It's 20 megawatts, 10 tons of hydrogen per day. It's the largest PEM electrolysis facility in the world. But on the books today, in that project portfolio that I showed you earlier, there are projects at 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts, and 300 megawatts, and announced plans at the gigawatt level. So we are moving very rapidly through those different orders of magnitude and scale. And that's what we expect will drive the cost reduction and a virtuous cycle of scale up. So yes, we're on our way.
Good. So let's just talk about, there's been a few questions about just the terminology. So let's just make sure we're clear on the terminology and what we mean by blue and green, because those terms are a little bit, I think, misleading as well. And so I just for the sake, so that everybody has the same understanding, can you explain what we mean when we talk about blue and then when we talk about green? And then can you sort of relate that to decarbonization and talk about carbon intensity? And so talk about how, carbon, hydrogen produced through electrolysis might not necessarily be have a low carbon intensity. It kind of depends on the power source. So maybe talk a little bit about that as well.
Correct.
So just so we have a sense of what we're talking about here.
So like many tools, they're developed to be helpful and to simplify the story, but eventually the tools start getting in the way. And I think on the color side of hydrogen, we're getting to the time where the colors are causing confusion and difficulty rather than clarity. But in any event, green hydrogen is produced typically through electrolysis. Blue hydrogen from natural gas with the carbon capture and storage technology, gray hydrogen when there's no capture of the CO2, and there's actually pink and purple as well, so hydrogen from nuclear energy. But in any event, the key point is what, in fact, is the extent of decarbonization. And so another part of our work on the council is to have the development of standards globally where the life cycle emission footprint of any particular pathway or hydrogen product can be delineated with clarity. If you buy a car in Europe today, right on the sticker sheet where the price is located and all the options are listed, the amount of CO2 emitted per kilometer of travel is listed as well. And I fully expect in the not too distant future, as hydrogen becomes a commodity and certain products like fertilizer that are derived from hydrogen intensive processes will start to declare the CO2 footprint of that particular good or hydrogen product. And so if this is an area of interest for you, I would encourage you to look to the Hydrogen Council reference document, the life cycle analysis of greenhouse gas emissions from hydrogen pathways. There's 8 pathways illustrated in the public report in detail, but beyond that, there's the ability to profile the detailed CO2 emissions depending on what the energy source is. So obviously the questioner picked up on the point, if your grid isn't very green, then nor is your hydrogen. And so we've depicted in that report hydrogen derived from the global average grid mix, which today is not very green. And we've also depicted what happens with the CO2 content of hydrogen, which is produced entirely from renewable energy. So these are very good points. We believe the future will be more like those cars in Europe, where the CO2 content will be clear and the methodology used to derive that content will also be clear.
Okay. One of the things, thanks for that. One of the things you mentioned is these different stories, and I'll use the blue and green terminology just for the sake of this discussion, and how in Texas we might have the opportunity for a combined story. So could you talk about why you see perhaps Texas as a potential place for the development of both a blue and a green story?
Mm-hmm. The blue story takes a lot of know-how and practice, principally in the oil and gas industry. So places like Texas and frankly here in Canada, where there's a lot of history, where there's a lot of history um, in the oil and gas sector. Um, there's skills and know-how on managing reservoirs, on managing pipelines, on uh, um, uh, you know, the exploration side of things, and understanding what the capability is of various reservoirs. So lots of capability to further develop on the blue hydrogen side. And those are skills that are all sitting there in Texas with lots of history and practice. On the green hydrogen side, the development of extensive wind and solar farms is all there as well. So you have the basic skill sets, background, and practice, and actual deployment of the technology on both sides of the house. That's what makes a very fascinating situation. And you have that stronger than many other regions in the world. And in terms of carbon capture and storage, the folks in Canada would be the second largest, with a 2-ton plant and 6 CO2 pipelines running into that plant in Canada. And then the UK and Norway on the other side of the ocean would have a lot of capability in CCS. But those are kind of the mainstays when it comes to CCS. So you're kind of top of the heap when it comes to that side of things and the blue hydrogen story. And then you have so much renewable energy already on the grid, and already you're seeing enough issues arising from fluctuating output from those facilities that the complement of hydrogen production assets is kind of, you're right on the precipice of seeing why that's valuable to you.
Well, okay, that's really interesting. And, it's interesting because we have this great story, but when we look at places across the globe that are being touted as potential leaders, we don't really see Texas showing up yet. Well, and why do you think that is, Daryl? And what can we do about it?
So I've mentioned several times this holistic, multidimensional aspect of hydrogen. So in order for a particular state or nation to really get going on this, there needs to be a coordinated effort to have a roadmap and a strategy that's thoughtful, that matches up the capability of hydrogen technology with the local endowment of energy resources and skills and resources. And so I'm not, I don't have detailed awareness of what's happening there. The fact that we're having this call, and Brett, you and I have met several times in the last couple of months, actually. My sense is a very productive conversation has started to unfold in Texas, and that's a great beginning. But it needs to coalesce then into an action plan, a roadmap, a strategy. And of course, the public sector and the government need to be involved as well. And in the state of Texas, you have a particular mindset and way of working together from a political and public point of view. But as that conversation progresses and turns into a roadmap and a strategy, and the extent that that roadmap and strategy is shared publicly and across the multiple sectors within society, then you're going to start to have a firm plan and be acting into it the way that these other governments and countries are in places like France and Germany. So I can remember back to 2008 and 2007 going to energy conferences in Texas. Hydrogen would be off in the little room with 15 people. It was kind of the sideshow. It seems to me that that's changed now. We're having these kind of discussions like we're having today, and I think that will, blossom and grow up into a fulsome strategy very soon.
Okay. Well, it's interesting because when I was a state regulator on the PUC, people didn't look at Texas as a leader in wind. They looked at California. And then, I kept telling some of the trade associations, come to Texas, and they would say, we're too busy in California. And then all of a sudden we saw this really amazing growth in the wind industry. And I understand this is policy driven. So, and that was one of the questions I think that we got when we were on the commission. Did we have the right policy framework to start incenting that sort of growth? So what would you advise us, Daryl, today in terms of trying to develop a policy framework that would incent people to think about Texas perhaps differently than they think about it today, as a leader in in the development of these hydrogen technologies?
Typically in other places in the world, a generally supportive context has been required, and often that's been about climate change and decarbonization. And so I think the national context and strong embrace of renewable energy and mitigating climate change is somewhat new, and I think it's enabling for sure. But I think it's important that the state of Texas do this in the Texan way. And even I recall learning that the development of wind power was not all about, CO2 mitigation or climate change management. There was a business opportunity to bring that resource onto the grid as an energy resource. And so the folks who developed the wind resources in Texas saw it as a business opportunity. And I think that's going to be, again, a very strong part of the hydrogen story in Texas. The fact is, it's already a very substantial business in Texas. So understanding what you have is the beginning, and then understanding how that moves from being an industrial molecule focus, an industrial gas focus, into an energy focus. That's kind of the change of mind, and to start to understand some of these downstream applications and how they can be enabled by hydrogen. So rather than having all the hydrogen oriented toward offtakes in the fertilizer business or the refinery business, actually start to realize that there are energy applications on buses, trucks, trains, and many other applications where hydrogen can be a source of energy input.
Well, thank you for that. I know we have actually 30 questions for you. So if you don't mind staying for a few hours and answering, seriously, this has really been hopefully a beginning of a dialogue, that we'll continue to have. I guess I just like to finish maybe with one other question and just get your thoughts on it, because some of the work we're doing at the center and trying to get the ball rolling, and as you mentioned, a lot of this started around decarbonization and being green. And you also mentioned that the green in Texas sometimes has to do more with creating the business opportunity. And so I wonder if you could just chat for just a few minutes on where you see the applications coming, and where those applications, where we in Texas ought to be focused in terms of applications for developing this resource.
Mm-hmm. Again, I'd refer you to our work. So I think it's thoughtful in parsing out all the various applications and their state of maturity. I showed that chart briefly. That is in the public domain. You can pull it down off of our website. And so it's a matter of matching up between what your needs and interests are. If there's lots of discussion about having electric buses, well, there are also fuel cell electric buses. If there are folks involved in the transport industry that would like to electrify their trucks, then Cummins has the capability of delivering a whole energy system for trucks, and a fleet of trucks could be electrified using hydrogen and be able to deliver the payload and the range that you might never do with a battery, but you can absolutely do with hydrogen. So I think the menu of options is large, and we've done some work that helps to show the prioritization of which options might fit your needs.
Great. Okay, well, we have to end, but this has been great. I hope we'll continue to have these kind of discussions going forward, and that this is the very beginning of this discussion. I will mention, you mentioned Cummins. We had Franklin Chang Diaz, former shuttle astronaut. He's built an amazing infrastructure in Costa Rica, where he's from. And so what I have told people is that this sort of idea of a hydrogen economy isn't rocket science. And hopefully that will be a story that we can continue to discuss. But Daryl, thank you so much for being with us, for sharing a few minutes. And we'll send you some of these questions, and hopefully there will be some opportunity for follow-up. I want to thank everybody who showed up today. We ended up with about 170, 180 participants on this website. This will obviously be available. The video will be available on our website afterwards. If people didn't have a chance, you can just let your colleagues know. And as I mentioned, we will be doing other webinars shortly on other issues that the center has been working on. our 2 white papers on hydrogen, and with our colleagues at University of Houston on CCUS will be coming out shortly. And I think we'll be having a webinar on how we put those 2 ideas together in creating a net zero carbon hub in Houston. So thank you for being with us today. Be safe, stay warm, and we look forward to seeing you in the near future. Take care.